The facility logs classified them as level 9 biohazards. To the guards, they were nightmare fuel wrapped in razor wire and obsidian scales. But when the containment alarm shrieked and heavily armed corporate soldiers finally kicked in the warped steel door to cell 42, they didn't find the expected bloodbath. Instead, they found 4 apex predators, teeth bared, corrosive acid dripping from their jaws, forming an impenetrable living wall around a shivering, feverish human. And the craziest part? The human just groaned, swatted weakly at a deadly snout, and went back to sleep. Here's why not a single guard dared to step forward. Caleb tossed on the narrow cot. The mattress was a synthetic sponge that somehow managed to be both painfully firm and entirely unsupportive. It smelled like industrial bleach, old sweat, and the metallic tang of the recycled air that pumped sluggishly through the vents of Outpost 44. He coughed, a dry rattling sound that tore at his throat, and stared up at the rusted grating of the ceiling. Tartarus 9 was not a planet that forgave mistakes. It was a miserable, ash-choked rock owned in its entirety by Apex Biosolutions. The company didn't mine for ore or drill for oil. They mined the native fauna. The local wildlife was uniquely adapted to a hyper-lethal environment, and Apex wanted the genetic patents for armor plating, corrosive enzymes, and neural stimulants. Caleb was not a scientist. He was not a corporate executive. He was a sanitation engineer, which was the HR department's polite way of saying he was the guy who hosed out the biopens when the scientists were done dissecting things. His joints ached with a deep, throbbing heat. The fever had been creeping up his spine for 3 days, the result of a careless scratch from a rusted containment grate in Sector 4. The company doctor, a sharp-featured man named Collins, who looked at the maintenance crew with the same clinical detachment he reserved for the lab rats, had diagnosed it as a mild strain of trench rot. Collins had prescribed a course of generic broad-spectrum antibiotics, denied Caleb a dose of the expensive med gel, and confined him to his quarters to prevent the spores from contaminating the sterile labs. So, Caleb lay there, shivering violently, despite the sweat soaking his thin gray uniform. His mind, clouded by the rising temperature of his own blood, kept drifting back to the holding pens. Specifically, to Pen 9. 3 weeks ago, the retrieval teams had dragged in a female night stalker. Even dead, the thing was terrifying. It looked like a wolf crossed with a deep-sea crustacean, boasting 6 muscular legs, overlapping plates of dark, iridescent chitin, and a jaw that unhinged to reveal 3 rows of serrated translucent teeth. The female had been gutted by a mining mech's plasma cutter, but she hadn't been alone. Nestled in the armored pouch beneath her thorax were 4 living offspring. Caleb remembered the smell of that day vividly. The air in the loading bay had been thick with the scent of ozone from the plasma burns and the sickeningly sweet, coppery odor of the stalker's blue blood. Dr. Collins had ordered the cubs isolated. He wanted to study their baseline aggression and metabolic degradation. In layman's terms, he wanted to see how long it took them to starve to death, and whether they would turn on each other when the hunger got bad enough. It was standard corporate cruelty, justified by profit margins and research metrics. For the first 4 days, the noise was unbearable. The cubs didn't cry like earthly animals. They produced a sound that was half hiss, half mechanical grinding. It resonated in the sub-basement pipes and echoed up into the crew quarters. It was a constant scraping whine that dug into the base of Caleb's skull and made his teeth ache. By the 5th day, Caleb snapped. He hadn't slept a full night since they brought the creatures in. He told himself it was just pragmatism. He just wanted the damn things to shut up so he could get a solid 4 hours of rest. He had waited until the second shift security detail rotated out. He bypassed the lower-level inventory locks, a trick he'd learned his first month on the Rock, and hauled a 20-gallon bucket of discarded synthetic protein sludge down to Pen 9. It was the refuse from the mess hall, mixed with expired nutrient paste. It looked like gray cement and smelled faintly of wet cardboard. When Caleb approached the reinforced glass of the pen, the 4 cubs threw themselves against it. They were only the size of medium dogs, but the impact shuddered the heavy panes. Their 4 milky blue eyes tracked his every movement. Acid sizzled at the corners of their mouths, scoring the reinforced floor plates. "Back off," Caleb had muttered, his voice echoing in the stark white corridor. He felt ridiculous talking to them, but the silence of the sub-basement was oppressive. He didn't open the main door. He wasn't suicidal. He used the automated feeding trough, dumping the gray sludge into the hopper and hitting the release valve. The trough slid into the pen. The cubs didn't eat. They attacked the food. They gorged themselves with a violent, terrifying desperation, their secondary jaws snapping and tearing at the thick paste. Caleb stood there, leaning against the cold glass, watching them. The awful grinding whine ceased, replaced by the wet sounds of feeding. One of the cubs, the smallest one, missing a chunk of its left ear plate from a sibling squabble, paused. It looked up through the glass at Caleb. The creature didn't wag a tail. It didn't look cute. Its face was a mask of primal, alien violence, but it let out a low, thrumming vibration from its chest. It sounded like a diesel engine idling. A purr. Caleb had snorted, rubbing the exhaustion from his eyes. "Don't get used to it, ugly," he had whispered, but he went back the next night, and the night after that. For 2 weeks, Caleb ran a clandestine soup kitchen for apex predators. He learned their quirks. The largest female, who he cynically dubbed Princess, always ate first. The runt, Buster, was the most observant. They learned the sound of Caleb's heavy, steel-toed boots on the grating. When he approached, they didn't throw themselves against the glass in a frenzy anymore. They sat, perfectly still, their 6 legs tucked under their armored bodies, watching him with an intelligence that made the hair on Caleb's arms stand up. But that was before the trench rot. Now Caleb was locked in his cell, burning from the inside out. He hadn't been down to Pen 9 in 3 days. He vaguely wondered if Collins had noticed the creatures weren't dead yet. He wondered if they had started eating each other. A sharp cramp seized his stomach, pulling him from his feverish memories. He curled into a tight ball on the mattress, burying his face in the thin, scratchy pillow. The silence in his quarters was absolute, save for the blood rushing in his own ears. Then the lights flickered. The dull yellow illumination of his ceiling bulb sputtered, dimmed, and died. A second later, the emergency backups kicked in, bathing the small room in a harsh, strobing crimson. Caleb groaned, squeezing his eyes shut against the piercing red flashes. "Great! Generator maintenance!" he rasped to the empty room, his throat dry as sandpaper. But it wasn't maintenance. A moment later, the automated klaxons began to wail. It was a high, undulating screech that penetrated the thick steel walls of the crew block. Containment breach. The fever warped Caleb's perception of time. The klaxons might have been blaring for 5 minutes or 5 hours. He drifted in and out of a shallow, sweaty delirium, pinned to the cot by the sheer weight of his own failing muscles. The red strobe light pulsed through his eyelids, synchronized with the pounding headache localized just behind his right temple. Through the haze, sensory details began to filter in, sharply out of place in the usually monotonous crew sector. He smelled smoke. Not the acrid tang of an electrical fire, but the heavy, chemical stench of burning synthetic flooring and vaporized metal. It drifted through the ventilation grate above his bed, stinging his nostrils. Then came the sounds. They were muffled by the heavy bulkhead door of his quarters, but unmistakable. The rapid staccato crack, crack, crack of corporate-issue pulse rifles. Heavy boots thudding in a chaotic sprint down the metal corridors. Muffled shouting. A scream that started high and was cut abruptly, violently short. Caleb tried to sit up, his hands gripping the edge of the mattress. His knuckles were white, his fingers trembling. The room spun wildly, the red light smearing into continuous ribbons of color. He collapsed back onto the pillow, gasping for air that felt too thin to breathe. "Not my problem," he mumbled to himself, his voice sounding entirely foreign to his own ears. "Security gets paid to shoot things. I just mop the blood." He closed his eyes, trying to force himself back into the dark void of unconsciousness. But the chaos outside was getting closer. The sounds of gunfire faded, replaced by something much worse. It was a sound Caleb knew intimately from his nights in the sub-basement, but amplified. The scraping of claws on reinforced steel. It wasn't just a few claws, it was a rhythmic, terrifying clatter, like a dozen industrial scythes being dragged across a metal grate. They got out, Caleb realized. A sudden, cold spike of adrenaline cutting through the fever haze. The stalkers. He pictured the 4 cubs. They weren't fully grown, but they were already 80 pounds of dense muscle, chitin, and teeth. If they had broken out of Pen 9, it meant they had bypassed the plasma grids. It meant they were desperate, starving, and highly aggressive. The clattering grew louder, accompanied by the distinct, wet sound of heavy breathing. They were in the crew block. Caleb lay perfectly still. He held his breath, his chest burning. The heavy footfalls paused right outside his door. "Please," he thought, staring at the locked, heavy iron handle of his door. "Keep walking. Go find Collins. He's got more meat on his bones anyway." A low, vibrating snarl vibrated through the metal of the bulkhead. It was a sound felt in the chest more than heard. Then something slammed into the door. The impact shook the entire wall. Dust and rust flakes rained down from the ceiling, dusting Caleb's sweat-soaked face. The thick steel of the door groaned. Another impact. This one was heavier, accompanied by the sickening sound of metal tearing. The locking mechanism squealed in protest. Caleb tried to push himself backward against the wall, but his limbs refused to cooperate. He was utterly defenseless. He didn't even have a hydrospanner to swing at them. He was going to be ripped apart in his own bed, too sick to even put up a fight. Crack. The reinforced hinges gave way. The door didn't burst inward. It was pried open. 4 sets of talons, slick with blue blood and dripping with yellow acid, hooked around the edges of the thick steel frame, and hauled it backward with terrifying mechanical strength. The door peeled away like the lid of a tin can, clattering loudly against the corridor wall. They stood in the doorway, framed by the pulsing red emergency lights. They were larger than Caleb remembered. 3 weeks of the high-protein paste had fueled a massive growth spurt. Their obsidian armor plates were flared outward, making them look jagged and massive. Steam rose from their bodies, mixing with the heavy scent of copper, ozone, and raw carnage. Their muzzles were stained deep red, human blood. Princess, the largest female, stepped into the room. Her 4 blue eyes locked instantly onto Caleb. She let out a soft, clicking hiss, her mandibles parting to reveal the serrated rows of teeth. Behind her, Buster and the other 2 crowded into the small space. The room temperature instantly spiked. They radiated heat like biological furnaces. Caleb couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He just stared, waiting for the pounce. He waited for the agony of those teeth sinking into his abdomen. Princess closed the distance in 2 steps. She loomed over the cot, her massive head hovering inches from Caleb's chest. A drop of thick, bloody saliva pooled at the corner of her jaw. It dropped, hitting the thin blanket covering Caleb's legs. It didn't burn. It was just wet and heavy. She lowered her snout, sniffing him. The inhalation was loud, a wet, snuffling sound. She nudged his shoulder with a chitinous nose, hard enough to bruise. Caleb let out a weak, pathetic groan. "Do it," he rasped, lacking the energy for fear. "Just make it quick. I feel like shit anyway." Princess didn't bite. Instead, she let out that same low, grinding thrum. The purr. She stepped awkwardly over his legs, her razor-sharp claws carefully avoiding his flesh, and curled her massive, heavy body at the foot of his bed. The mattress sagged dangerously under her weight. Buster was next. The runt moved to the left side of the cot, pressing his heavily armored flank tightly against Caleb's ribs. The alien's body heat was intense, burning right through the thin blanket. Buster rested his heavy, jagged head heavily on Caleb's chest, pinning him down. The other 2 filled the remaining space, one pressing against his right side, the other curling up on the floor directly beneath the bed, blocking the only avenue of approach. Within seconds, Caleb was entirely entombed in a mountain of coarse, thermal fur and hardened chitin. The smell of blood and ozone was overpowering, making him gag weakly. What are you doing?" Caleb mumbled, delirious. He tried to shove Buster's head off his chest, but his arm felt like lead. He managed to drape his hand over the cub's thick neck. The coarse fur beneath the armor plates was hot and rough, like steel wool. Buster let out a huff, a burst of hot, meat-scented air hitting Caleb's face, and began to lick Caleb's burning forehead. The tongue was agonizingly rough, like a rasp meant to strip flesh from bone. But it was cool. Caleb winced, but he didn't pull away. The shivering that had racked his body for 3 days began to subside, combated by the overwhelming, furnace-like heat of the 4 predators pressing against him. The grinding mechanical purrs of the stalkers synchronized, creating a deep, resonant vibration that shook the entire bed. It was utterly bizarre. It was a nightmare scenario. Yet, as the fever pulled him back down into the dark, the last thing Caleb felt wasn't terror. It was warmth. He closed his eyes, his hand resting limply on the armor of a killer, and let the darkness take him. Commander Mike hated the sub-levels. He hated the flickering lights, the damp chill, and most of all, he hated the things the eggheads kept down here. He gripped his plasma rifle, his tactical light cutting through the smoke-filled corridor of the crew block. Behind him, a squad of 4 heavily armored corporate security officers moved with tight, suppressed panic. They had already lost 3 men in the biolab corridors. The stalkers had hit them like a freight train, moving too fast for human reflexes, striking from the ventilation shafts, and tearing through Kevlar mesh like it was wet parchment. "Blood trail leads this way," whispered Davis, the squad's point man, gesturing with the barrel of his weapon toward the breached door of cell 42. The heavy steel had been peeled back, bent outward into the hallway. The edges of the metal were smoking slightly, sizzling with residual acid. Mike swallowed hard, tasting the bitter copper of fear in the back of his throat. "All right, tight formation. We go in, we light them up. Do not hesitate. Aim for the joints or the eyes. The carapace will deflect standard rounds." They stacked up by the ruined doorway. Mike held up 3 fingers. 2, 1. He pivoted around the frame, bringing his rifle up, the blinding beam of his weapon light sweeping the small, cramped room. "Apex security, freeze!" he bellowed, a command driven by pure muscle memory rather than logic. The light hit the bed, and Mike's brain short-circuited. He didn't fire. Behind him, Davis and the others poured into the doorway, weapons raised, and immediately froze, creating a sudden, claustrophobic bottleneck. The room was a slaughterhouse waiting to happen, but the slaughter wasn't occurring. On the center of the sagging cot lay Caleb, the sanitation tech Mike vaguely recognized from the mess hall. The man looked awful, pale as a sheet, covered in sweat, completely motionless. Surrounding him, entirely engulfing his form, were the 4 level 9 biohazards. The moment Mike's light hit them, the room erupted into a cacophony of violence. Not movement, but sound. Princess, coiled at the foot of the bed, rose up on her 4 hind legs. Her throat expanded, and a roar tore from her maw. A deafening, concussive wave of sound that physically rattled the tactical helmets of the security team. Buster, draped over Caleb's chest, didn't move off the human. Instead, he snapped his head toward the door, his secondary jaws clicking furiously, acid thick and yellow dripping from his teeth onto the metal floor where it hissed and smoked. The other 2 bristle-hacked, their armor plates rising to create a jagged, impenetrable dome over the bed. "Jesus Christ," Davis breathed, his finger trembling on the trigger of his rifle. "They're eating him." "Hold your fire," Mike snapped, grabbing the barrel of Davis's gun and forcing it down an inch. "Look at them." Mike's combat instincts were screaming at him to pull the trigger, but his eyes were relaying information that his brain refused to process. The stalkers weren't tearing Caleb apart. They weren't fighting over a meal. They were in a defensive perimeter. Every terrifying instinct of the apex predators was currently focused entirely on the men in the doorway. Princess shifted her weight, placing her massive armored body directly between the barrels of the pulse rifles and Caleb's sleeping form. She lowered her head, her 4 blue eyes dilated against the harsh tactical lights, tracking Mike's every twitch. "Commander," one of the guards in the back choked out. "We have a clear shot at the big one's head." If you miss the brainstem by a fraction of a millimeter, she'll close the distance before you can pull the trigger a second time, Mike said, his voice tight. And if she doesn't, the other three will. Any crossfire hits the civvy. He's dead anyway, Davis argued, his voice pitching up in panic. Look at the blood on their mouths. That's Jenkins' blood from the biolab, you idiot, Mike hissed. Look at the tech. He's breathing. The standoff stretched into agonizing seconds. The air in the room was thick, heavy with the stench of the creatures and the oppressive heat they radiated. Mike's arms began to ache from holding the heavy rifle steady. Sweat stung his eyes. He knew he was losing control of the situation. The adrenaline in his squad was peaking. Someone was going to twitch, and then everyone in this room was going to die. Princess took a half step forward, the floor plates groaning under her weight. The warning was clear. Leave. Then the pile of armor and fur on the bed shifted. A groan, entirely human and profoundly annoyed, cut through the tense silence. Beneath the massive head of the runt, Caleb stirred. He weakly brought up a hand, slapping clumsily at the jagged chitin resting on his chest. "Get off," Caleb rasped, his voice raw and weak. "You weigh a ton." The security squad watched in sheer, unadulterated horror as the human pushed against the deadly creature. Buster didn't snap. He didn't tear Caleb's arm off. The terrifying, acid-spitting nightmare simply whined, a high, pathetic sound, and shifted its weight, sliding off Caleb's chest to rest heavily against his side instead. Caleb squeezed his eyes shut, turning his head away from the blinding tactical lights. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound, and brought a hand up to shield his face. "Turn off the damn lights, Mike," Caleb groaned, his voice carrying the sheer irritation of a man waking up to a hangover. "You're giving me a migraine." Mike's jaw dropped. He slowly, mechanically, clicked his tactical light off. The red emergency strobes bathed the room in dim crimson again. Caleb sighed in relief. He didn't sit up. He didn't look at the heavily armed guards. He just let his arm fall, completely by accident, over Princess's massive, razor-sharp front leg. Princess stopped snarling instantly. The deadly, vibrating hum returned to her chest. She looked at Mike, her jaw closing, and rested her chin on the edge of the mattress, right next to Caleb's knee. "Caleb," Mike managed to say, his voice completely devoid of its usual authority. It was the voice of a man watching water flow uphill. What the hell is happening?" Caleb didn't open his eyes. He was already drifting back into the fever sleep, anchored by the oppressive, comforting heat of the monsters. "They're just hungry, Mike," Caleb slurred, pulling the thin blanket up, dragging Buster's heavy snout with it. "Tell Collins to buy better paste." Silence descended on the room, broken only by the synchronized grinding purr of 4 apex predators. Mike looked at Davis. Davis looked at the floor. The pulse rifles felt useless, absurd toys in the face of whatever bizarre, impossible contract the human on the bed had just forged. Slowly, carefully, Mike lowered his weapon. He took a single step backward into the corridor. No guard dared to step forward, not a single one. Commander Mike backed out of the doorway, his boots scuffing the steel floor plating. He didn't lower his rifle completely, keeping the barrel pointed at the deck, his finger resting rigidly on the trigger guard. Behind him, His squad mirrored the retreat, shuffling backward until their backs hit the far wall of the corridor. The air out here was drastically colder, pumping through the emergency vents at a brisk 60 degrees. But sweat was pouring down the back of Mike's neck. "Maintain the perimeter," Mike ordered, his voice a harsh, breathless rasp. "Nobody shoots unless they cross the threshold." Davis leaned against the corridor wall, ripping his tactical helmet off and letting it clatter to the deck. He dry heaved twice, clutching his stomach. The smell radiating from cell 42 was an atrocious cocktail of burnt ozone, unwashed human sweat, and the pungent, ammonia-rich musk of the predators. It was the smell of the sublevels, dragged up into the sterile living quarters. They're just sitting there," Davis panted, wiping spit from his chin. "Why aren't they killing him?" Before Mike could formulate an answer that didn't sound insane, the heavy security doors at the end of the block hissed open. Dr. Collins strode through the smoke, flanked by 2 more heavily armed corporate enforcers. Collins looked entirely out of place in the chaotic, red-lit hallway. He wore a crisp, white lab coat over a tailored gray suit, his boots spotless. He didn't carry a weapon, only a ruggedized data pad clamped tightly in his left hand. The man smelled faintly of isopropyl alcohol and expensive synthetic cologne, a sharp, sterile scent that immediately cut through the heavy musk in the air. "Commander Mike," Collins said, his tone flat, completely devoid of the panic that had currently gripped the security detail. "The proximity alarms indicate the Level 9 assets have localized in this sector. I expected them to be terminated by now. The loss of lab personnel is already a severe detriment to my quarterly budget." Mike stared at the doctor, feeling a sudden, intense urge to strike him with the butt of his rifle. "They're in cell 42, Doc, but we have a situation." Collins adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his pale eyes narrowing. "A situation? The protocol for a Class A biological breach is total pacification. There is no situation, Commander. There is only failure to execute orders." "Take a look for yourself," Mike said, stepping aside and gesturing to the ruined doorway. "But move slow. They're jumpy." Collins gave Mike a look of profound disdain, stepping forward to peer around the bent steel frame. The reaction was instantaneous. While the stalkers had watched the guards with a tense, coiled aggression, their reaction to Collins was absolute, violent hatred. The moment the sterile scent of alcohol and cologne drifted into the small room, Princess snapped her head up. The low, grinding purr that had been shaking Caleb's bed vanished, replaced by a wet, rattling hiss. She didn't just stand. She lunged forward, putting her front 2 legs on the floor while her hind legs remained planted on the mattress. Her mandibles flared wide, revealing the translucent, serrated teeth, and a thick glob of yellow acid spat from her throat, sizzling violently against the doorframe just inches from Collins's face. Collins scrambled backward, dropping his datapad, his composure shattering. Inside the room, the other 3 cubs erupted. Buster rose, placing one massive paw squarely on Caleb's chest to anchor himself, and roared, a mechanical, scraping sound that vibrated in the fillings of the guard's teeth. The creatures didn't attack, but they formed a tight, impenetrable wall of spiked chitin and snapping jaws between the doctor and the sanitation worker on the bed. "What in God's name?" Collins breathed, staring at the bubbling acid eating through the steel plating of the doorway. He looked from the monsters to the pale, motionless human trapped beneath them. Is that the maintenance tech?" The one with trench rot? Yeah, Mike said, his grip tightening on his rifle. That's Caleb. And if you order me to light this room up, Doc, those rounds are going to go right through him. They're defending him, Collins murmured, his initial shock rapidly dissolving into cold, clinical fascination. He picked up his datapad, wiping a smudge of ash from the screen. Fascinating, highly territorial pack behavior, redirected toward a non-conspecific host. They've imprinted on him. I don't care if they think he's their mother, Doc, Mike growled. How do we get him out? Collins looked at Mike as if the commander had just suggested tearing up a winning lottery ticket. Get him out? Commander, do you have any idea how much Apex Biosolutions has spent trying to find a biological pacification agent for the native fauna of Tartarus 9? We've tried neuroinhibitors, synthetic pheromones, genetic neutering, all failures. And here we have a raw, unedited behavioral anomaly. He's a human being, Collins. He's sick. He's an Apex employee, Collins corrected smoothly, tapping away at his screen, which means his biology, and whatever interaction he is currently having with corporate assets, belongs to the company. Mike stared at the doctor, the cynical reality of corporate space settling heavily in his gut. They weren't going to rescue Caleb. They were going to watch. Fall back to the intersection, Collins ordered, not looking up from his screen. Seal the blast doors at the end of the hall. Set up thermal monitors and sonic microphones. I want a 24-hour feed on this cell. You're trapping him in there with them, Davis whispered, horrified. I am securing an ongoing experiment, Collins replied coldly. If the host expires from his illness, or if the assets decide to consume him, you may then proceed with the termination protocol. Until then, Cell 42 is classified as an active observation vivarium. The fever broke somewhere around hour 40. Caleb didn't wake up all at once. Consciousness returned in agonizing, fragmented layers. First came the physical sensations. His skin felt tight and entirely drained of moisture, as if he had been baked in a kiln. His head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, and his mouth tasted like old pennies and dust. Then came the weight. He tried to draw a deep breath, but his ribcage wouldn't expand. There was a localized, crushing pressure on his sternum, and his lower legs were completely immobilized by something massive and impossibly hot. He forced his eyes open. The harsh, strobing red of the emergency lights had been replaced by a dim, steady amber glow from the backup emergency strips running along the baseboards. Directly in front of his face, mere inches from his nose, was an expanse of dark, iridescent armor plating. It was rising and falling in a steady, heavy rhythm. Caleb blinked, his brain sluggishly trying to process the visual data. He smelled copper. He smelled wet, coarse fur. Hey, Caleb rasped. His throat felt like it was coated in ground glass. The armor plating shifted. A massive head, shaped like a jagged wedge of obsidian, slowly lifted. 4 milky blue eyes blinked lazily down at him. Buster. The creature let out a soft, clicking huff. It sounded almost questioning. Memory rushed back, hitting Caleb like a physical blow. The sirens, the breach, the monstrous shapes piling onto his bed, the heavily armed security team standing in the doorway, paralyzed by the sheer absurdity of the scene. He was alive. He hadn't been eaten. Caleb slowly, painfully turned his head. princess was draped across his legs, her massive head resting on the edge of the mattress, fast asleep. A pool of clear, viscous drool had soaked into the thin blanket near his knee. The other two were wedged tightly against his sides, pinning his arms. He was cocooned in alien muscle and chitin. The heat they gave off was suffocating, easily pushing the temperature of the small room past 90 degrees. But it had also sweat the trench rot out of his system. The deep, bone-rattling ache of the infection was gone, replaced by the profound, hollow exhaustion of a body that had barely survived a war with itself. "Okay," Caleb whispered to the empty room. "Okay, this is happening." He tried to slide his right arm out from under the bulk of the cub pressing against him. The creature, he hadn't named this one, but it had a distinct scar across its snout, grumbled, a low, vibrating growl of protest, and leaned heavier against him. "Look, I need to move," Caleb muttered, his voice cracking. He felt ridiculous reasoning with a bioweapon, but the alternative was panicking, and panicking seemed like a fantastic way to get his throat torn out. He pushed his palm against the rough, steel-wool fur beneath Buster's neck. "Off! Come on, ugly! Up!" Buster's mandibles clicked. He lowered his massive head, sniffing Caleb's face intently. The wet, snuffling sound was incredibly loud in the quiet room. The alien seemed to register the change in Caleb's scent, the lack of fever, the shift in his sweat. Buster huffed again, then slowly, reluctantly, shifted his weight off Caleb's chest, sliding down to stand on the floor beside the bed. Instantly, the other three woke up. Princess lifted her head, her blue eyes narrowing. She didn't look at Caleb. She looked at the doorway. Caleb followed her gaze. The steel door was gone, pried away. In the corridor beyond, he could see the harsh white glare of a portable work lamp and the distinct, blocky shape of a heavy auto-turret tripod set up 20 feet down the hall. They had barricaded him in. A cold spike of anger pierced through Caleb's exhaustion. He knew corporate protocol. He knew Dr. Collins. The moment he realized the situation, Caleb understood the grim reality. They weren't waiting to rescue him. They were observing. He was no longer a sanitation engineer. He was an interactive prop in a twisted behavioral study. "Bastards," Caleb coughed, rubbing his chest where Buster had bruised his ribs. He needed water. The thirst was suddenly overwhelming, a desperate, frantic need that eclipsed his fear of the creatures surrounding him. He sat up slowly. The room spun, black spots dancing in his vision. He gripped the edge of the mattress, waiting for the vertigo to pass. Princess stood up on the bed, towering over him. She was easily the size of a mountain lion now, thick and heavily armored. She looked down at him, her mandibles parting slightly. Caleb looked up into her alien face. There was no warmth there, no canine affection, just a cold, calculating intelligence. But she didn't bite. She just waited. "I'm getting up," Caleb announced to the room, treating them like volatile explosives. "Just going to the sink. Nobody freak out." Getting off the bed was an ordeal. Caleb swung his legs over the side, but the floor space was entirely occupied by the restless pacing of the three other stalkers. The cell was 10 feet by 12 feet. Deducting the bed, the small metal desk, and the aluminum sink in the corner, There was virtually zero square footage left for a grown man and 4 apex predators. He placed a bare foot on the cold steel grating of the floor. Buster immediately stepped forward, his jagged snout pressing aggressively against Caleb's knee. Caleb froze. The sharp edge of a chitinous plate dug painfully into his bare skin. Show no fear, a distant, pragmatic part of his brain whispered. If you act like prey, they'll treat you like prey. He remembered the sub-basement. He remembered hauling the heavy buckets of gray sludge. He hadn't been afraid of them then. He had just been annoyed by the noise. He needed to channel that annoyance now. "Move it, Buster," Caleb said, injecting a firm, irritated tone into his weak voice. He nudged the heavy creature with his knee. Buster let out a sharp hiss, a warning sound. Acid sizzled faintly at the corners of his mouth. Caleb didn't back down. He couldn't. If he let them pin him to the bed, he would die of dehydration before the corporate cameras. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and placed his palm flat against the side of Buster's heavily armored head. He shoved, not hard, but with intent. "I said, move!" Buster blinked his 4 eyes. The hiss died in his throat. The creature actually took a step back, its claws clicking against the floor grates. Caleb exhaled a shaky breath, standing up. His legs felt like wet noodles, shaking under his own weight. He took a step toward the corner of the room. The pack moved with him. It was a terrifying, suffocating escort. As he took a step, Princess dropped off the bed, silently flanking his left side. The scarred one flanked his right. They didn't bump into him, moving with a fluid, terrifying grace that belied their heavy armor, but they boxed him in completely. He reached the small aluminum sink. The mirror above it was cracked, reflecting a pale, hollow-eyed ghost wearing a sweat-stained gray uniform. Behind his reflection, the hulking shadows of the stalkers loomed, a nightmare painted in dim amber light. Caleb gripped the rusted handle of the tap and cranked it open. The pipes groaned. A sputter of rust-brown water shot out, splashing against the metal basin, before smoothing out into a thin, clear stream. He didn't bother with a cup. He cupped his hands beneath the stream and brought the freezing, metallic-tasting water to his face. He drank greedily, the water spilling down his chin and soaking his shirt. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. He drank until his stomach ached, then splashed handfuls of cold water over his face and neck, washing away the dried sweat and the lingering heat of the fever. A heavy weight pressed against his hip. Caleb looked down. Buster had shoved his wedge-shaped head past Caleb's arm, his mandibles clicking near the running tap. The creature was staring intently at the water. "You thirsty too?" Caleb mumbled, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. It made sense. They had been locked in this dry, hot room for over a day. In the sub-basement, their feeding trough had an automated hydration line. Here, they had nothing. Caleb stepped back slightly, keeping his hand near the tap. Buster didn't hesitate. The creature leaned forward, its secondary jaws extending slightly. A long, dark, heavily textured tongue snaked out, lapping at the stream of water. It drank with a frantic, desperate energy, water splashing against its chitinous face. Princess pushed her way forward, snapping her jaws at Buster's flank. Buster snarled, a deep, vibrating warning, but stepped aside, letting the larger female take the tap. Caleb watched the surreal scene unfold. 4 lethal predators, creatures engineered by nature to tear through reinforced steel and digest raw meat, were taking turns drinking from his tiny, rusted bathroom sink. He looked toward the ruined doorway. Down the hall, he could see the red, blinking light of a camera mounted on the auto turret. They were watching. Collins was watching. A dark, cynical realization settled over Caleb. He wasn't some magical beastmaster. There was no psychic bond here. The creatures had broken out of their pen, starving and desperate. They had followed the only scent they associated with food and survival, the smell of the sanitation worker who fed them when the scientists forgot. They had found him sick and radiating heat, a perfect, warm nest in a freezing metal facility. They weren't defending him against the guards. They were defending their food source, their heat source, their territory. He was their property. Princess finished drinking. She turned her massive head, water dripping from her terrifying jaws, and looked at Caleb. She stepped close, her armored shoulder brushing against his leg, and let out that low, engine-like purr. It wasn't a purr of affection. It was a purr of possession. Yeah, I know," Caleb whispered, reaching down instinctively. He dragged his hand over the thick, coarse fur of her neck, avoiding the razor-sharp edges of her plating. The creature leaned into the touch, a massive, deadly engine of destruction, accepting a scratch behind the ears. Caleb looked back at the camera blinking down the hall. If Collins wanted an experiment, he was going to get one. Caleb was trapped, unarmed, and surrounded by monsters. But for the first time since he arrived on this ash-choked rock, he didn't feel entirely helpless. He wasn't a corporate asset anymore. He was the alpha of the most dangerous pack on Tartarus 9. "All right," Caleb said, his voice dropping the last traces of sickness, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. He looked down at the 4 pairs of blue eyes staring back at him. "Let's figure out how we're going to get out of this room." Caleb turned away from the sink, water dripping from his chin onto his stained uniform. He looked past the massive armored bulk of Princess and stared down the corridor. 30 feet away, past the ruined doorway of Cell 42, the auto turret sat on its heavy tripod. It was an Apex Mk4, a brutal piece of corporate hardware designed for riot suppression and perimeter defense. Its twin heavy-caliber barrels were locked directly onto the center of Caleb's chest. Above the barrels, a small red sensor lens blinked with rhythmic mechanical indifference. They were trapped. Caleb walked slowly toward the jagged edges of the broken door frame. Instantly, the pack shifted. Buster and the unnamed scarred cub, Caleb mentally dubbed him Scrap, flanked his legs, their claws clicking sharply against the metal grating. Princess followed a step behind, a heavy, silent shadow. When Caleb reached the threshold, he stopped. He didn't cross the invisible line. The turret's servos whined, a high-pitched, barely audible hum as it tracked his micro-movements. "Hey!" Caleb shouted, his voice cracking on the dry, recycled air of the corridor. "Collins, I know you're watching!" The corridor swallowed his voice. For a long minute, there was nothing but the steady hum of the ventilation system and the wet, heavy breathing of the predators surrounding him. Then, a sharp burst of static crackled from the small intercom speaker mounted on the wall just outside his door. "Your vitals have stabilized," Dr. Collins' voice echoed through the tinny speaker. The audio was crisp, devoid of any static or emotion. "Fascinating," The proximity to the asset's core body temperature appears to have flash-cooked the trench rot spores out of your bloodstream. A crude but undeniably effective biological purge. "Get this turret out of my face, Doc," Caleb said, leaning against the cold steel of the wall, keeping his hands visible. "And send down a supply of the protein paste. A lot of it." "I'm afraid that isn't possible, Caleb." "They're starving, Collins," Caleb snapped, feeling a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He looked down at Scrap. The cub was chewing obsessively on the corner of the metal doorframe, its secondary jaws grinding the reinforced steel into twisted ribbons. Acid dripped from its mouth, sizzling against the floor. "You know their metabolic rate. If you don't feed them, they're going to eat me. And then they're going to break out and eat you." "Your concern is noted," Collins replied smoothly. "However, introducing an external food source would contaminate the behavioral data. We are currently observing a localized alpha imprinting phenomenon. We need to document the degradation of this bond under the stress of extreme caloric deficit. Simply put, we need to know at what point their predatory instinct overrides their territorial attachment to you." Caleb stared at the blinking red light of the camera. The sheer clinical psychopathy of the corporate mindset was staggering. Collins wasn't just willing to let Caleb die. He was actively scheduling it into his quarterly research metrics. "You son of a bitch," Caleb whispered. "Try to remain calm," Collins advised, the intercom buzzing softly. "Elevated heart rates will only trigger their hunting responses. The cameras are recording. Your sacrifice will yield invaluable data for the pacification program." The intercom clicked off. The heavy silence rushed back in. Caleb stepped back into the sweltering heat of the cell. The situation had shifted from a bizarre standoff into a ticking clock. He looked at the pack. Buster was pacing the tight confines of the room, his movements jerky and agitated. The low rumbling purr that had filled the room earlier was gone, replaced by a constant, wet hissing. They were already feeling the hunger. The energy they had expended breaking out of the sub-basement and maintaining their elevated body heat was catching up to them. Princess stood in the center of the room, watching Caleb. Her 4 blue eyes were unreadable, but Caleb noticed the way her gaze briefly flicked down to his arm. It wasn't an aggressive look, but it was calculating. She wasn't looking at a master. She was looking at 95,000 calories of raw protein. "No," Caleb said aloud, pointing a finger directly at her massive snout. "Don't even think about it." Princess blinked, letting out a short, clicking huff. She turned her head away, but the tension in her heavy shoulders didn't relax. Caleb began to pace, stepping carefully over the restless bodies of the cubs. He couldn't fight the turret. He couldn't fight the stalkers. He was a sanitation tech with no weapons, locked in a steel box. But he was a sanitation tech. He knew this outpost better than the guards who patrolled it. He knew the maintenance logs, the plumbing routes, the ventilation shafts. He knew that Tartarus 9 was a modular facility, built cheap and fast by corporate contractors who cut corners wherever possible. He stopped pacing and looked at the back wall of the cell. Specifically, he looked at the small aluminum sink and the cracked mirror above it. The front of the cell, facing the corridor, was reinforced titanium steel. It had to be, to withstand explosive decompression or a riot. But the wall behind the sink wasn't a structural bulkhead. It was a wet wall, a hollow partition designed to house the complex web of pipes and filtration tubes that recycled the outpost's water supply. Behind that thin layer of paneled steel was a primary maintenance shaft. Caleb walked over to the small metal desk bolted to the floor. It was a flimsy, stamped aluminum thing. He grabbed the edge of the desk with both hands and pulled. His muscles, still weak from the fever, trembled and burned. The desk groaned, but the bolts held. He kicked the leg, frustratingly ineffective. A heavy shadow fell over him. Scrap had padded over, his jagged head tilting to the side as he watched Caleb struggle. Caleb stopped. He looked at the desk, then looked at Scrap's terrifying jaws. "Hey," Caleb said, stepping back and tapping the edge of the desk. "You like chewing on metal? Bite this." Scrap hissed, thick acid bubbling at his lips. The cub stepped forward, opened its jaws, and clamped down on the thick aluminum corner of the desk. The sound was deafening, a horrific screech of tearing metal. The cub's jaw pressure was astronomical. Scrap wrenched his massive neck backward, and the desk sheared clean off its mountings, flipping through the air and crashing violently against the opposite wall. Caleb winced at the noise, but he immediately scrambled over and picked up one of the jagged, broken aluminum legs. It was sharp, a makeshift pry bar. He turned back to the sink. The pack was watching him intently now, their predatory instincts triggered by the sudden violence and noise. Caleb wedged the sharp end of the aluminum leg into the seam between the sink basin and the wall panel. He leaned his entire body weight against it. The metal squealed, bowing outward slightly, but it wouldn't pop. "Come on," Caleb grunted, sweat beading on his forehead. "Give." He felt a massive, localized heat radiating against his right side. Princess had moved up beside him. She wasn't looking at the sink. She was looking at Caleb's hands, her mandibles twitching. Caleb stepped back, dropping the bar. "You want to help? Pull it." He pointed at the gap he had created. Princess stared at the wall. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the intent of the barricade. She stepped forward, hooking the massive sickle-shaped talons of her front right leg into the narrow gap behind the sink. She didn't strain. She simply pulled. The heavy steel panel ripped away from the wall with a sound like a bomb detonating. The sink basin was torn entirely free, the pressurized water pipes snapping like dry twigs. A geyser of rust-colored water blasted into the room, hitting the ceiling and raining down on the pack. The stalkers shrieked, backing away from the sudden spray, violently shaking the water from their dark armor. Caleb ignored the water soaking him. He stared into the dark, gaping hole in the wall. Behind the shattered pipes, a heavy secondary maintenance hatch was visible. It was locked from the outside, thick and rusted shut. Caleb couldn't pry it open. Even Princess couldn't rip it off without leverage. But Caleb didn't need leverage. He needed chemistry. The cell flooded fast. Rust-colored water pooled around Caleb's ankles, swirling sluggishly down the floor grates. The stalkers hated it. They huddled in the dry corner, their armor plates bristling, hissing at the geyser spraying from the broken pipe. Caleb ignored the water soaking his uniform. He leaned into the dark cavity of the wet wall, wiping grime from the secondary maintenance hatch. It was solid iron, thick, rusted shut. He couldn't pry it open, and even Princess couldn't rip it off without leverage. He needed chemistry. Caleb turned and looked at Buster. "Buster, here." He slapped the iron hatch with his palm. A sharp clang echoed over the rushing water. Buster stayed put. The cub let out a miserable, vibrating whine and shook a wet paw. Caleb needed them aggressive. He waded over, ignoring the screaming instinct that told him not to corner a frightened monster. He grabbed the coarse, wet fur behind Buster's neck and physically hauled the heavy creature toward the wall. "I said get over here," Caleb yelled. Buster snapped. He didn't bite, but his massive head twisted, his jaws clapping shut inches from Caleb's nose. The shockwave popped Caleb's ears. Buster let out a concussive roar, pure, territorial fury, and pulled his lips back. A thick glob of yellow fluid launched from his throat. Caleb threw himself backward into the shallow water. The acid missed him entirely. It hit the dead center of the iron hatch. The reaction was immediate. A thick cloud of putrid gray smoke erupted. The sound was horrific, a vicious, wet sizzling, like meat thrown onto a white-hot grill. The stench of vaporized iron and sulfur punched Caleb in the lungs, making him gag violently. "More!" Caleb choked out, crawling backward. He banged his makeshift aluminum pry bar against the wall. "Get it!" The noise and the sharp chemical scent of the acid triggered the rest of the pack. The territorial frenzy took over. Scrap lunged past Caleb, burying his jagged face into the smoke, and spat a secondary volley directly onto the locking mechanism. Princess joined in, slamming her heavy front claws against the weakening metal, her own acid dripping from her mandibles to further compromise the iron. Caleb pressed himself low to the floor, breathing the thin layer of clean air beneath the rising toxic smoke. He watched, terrified and awestruck, as the predators systematically dismantled the barricade. The iron hatch sagged, glowing a dull, molten orange around the hinges. Princess reared up on her hind legs. She drove both of her massive, chitinous fists directly into the center of the molten iron. The hatch blew outward with a heavy crunch, disappearing into the dark maintenance shaft. A rush of cold, stale air sucked into the sweltering cell. Caleb didn't hesitate. He scrambled up onto the ruined sink pedestal and dove through the jagged hole, scraping his ribs on the hot metal. He landed hard on the steel grating of the maintenance tunnel. It was pitch black, tight, and smelled of dust and old machine grease. A second later, Princess squeezed through the breach, her heavy claws scraping the metal. She dropped beside Caleb. Her 4 eyes adjusted instantly, glowing with a faint, bioluminescent menace. Buster and Scrap followed, sealing the pack into the narrow artery of the station. A wet, cold nose nudged Caleb's cheek. "All right," Caleb whispered, adrenaline making his hands shake. "We go up. Follow the ventilation drafts." He began to crawl. The steel grating bit into his bare knees, but he didn't stop. Behind him, the massive shadows of the pack moved in perfect, terrifying synchronization. The claustrophobic tunnel didn't hinder them. They were ambush predators, born for the tight subterranean caverns of Tartarus 9. They didn't growl. They didn't hiss. Their silence was worse than their roars. They crawled for 20 agonizing minutes until the air current changed. A draft of hyper-filtered air blew down from a heavy access grate above them. Dim, white light painted pale stripes across the dark armor of the stalkers. Caleb pressed his ear against the cold metal. "Lost them in the blind spots," Commander Mike's panicked voice filtered down. "Lock down the primary bulkheads," Dr. Collins replied, his voice tight but clinical. "Flood the lower tunnels with neurotoxin. Doc, that bleeds into life support. We'll gas the whole sector." "Then issue rebreathers," Collins snapped. "Those assets represent billions. They cannot reach the surface." Caleb lay on his back, staring at the grate. He looked at Princess. Her head was tilted upward, mandibles parted in a silent, deadly promise. He gripped the heavy locking levers. He wasn't just a heat source anymore. He was leading the hunt. "No killing," Caleb whispered to the dark, pointing a stern finger at Princess. "We scare them. Understand?" Princess let out a single, low rumble in her chest. Caleb pulled the levers and kicked the grate upward. The heavy steel grate flew upward, clattering violently against the pristine white floor tiles of the main observation deck. Before the echo even registered in the room, the pack erupted from the hole. It wasn't a scramble. It was a geyser of black chitin, claws, and sheer violence. Princess launched herself straight up, easily clearing the 8-foot ceiling of the tunnel, and landed heavily on top of a central holographic plotting table. The glass shattered instantly beneath her weight. Buster and Scrap fanned out the moment their claws hit the tiles, moving with a blinding, terrifying speed. They flanked the room, cutting off the heavy blast doors that led to the security elevators. "Contact! Contact!" Mike screamed, backpedaling wildly, bringing his heavy pulse rifle up. He didn't even get a chance to aim. Scrap vaulted off a computer console, clearing 20 feet in a single bound, and slammed chest first into Mike. The impact sounded like a car crash. Mike was thrown backward, his rifle spinning out of his hands, his heavy tactical armor absorbing the brunt of the blow, but the breath was knocked cleanly from his lungs. Scrap pinned the commander to the floor, placing one massive, razor-sharp paw firmly on Mike's chest plate. The cub lowered its jagged snout, secondary jaws extending to snap viciously inches from Mike's face shield. Acid dripped onto the reinforced glass, smoking instantly. Mike froze, entirely paralyzed by the sheer proximity of death. The two other corporate guards in the room panicked. One raised his weapon, aiming wildly at Buster. Princess roared, a concussive, deafening wave of sound that shattered the remaining glass displays in the room. She leapt from the broken table, interposing her massive armored body between the guard and the cub. She didn't attack. She simply stood there, an impenetrable wall of spiked obsidian, her throat swelling as she prepared to spit a volley of acid that would melt the man to the bone. The guard dropped his rifle, raising his hands in sheer terror. The room fell into a sudden, heavily breathing standstill. The ambush had taken less than 4 seconds. Not a single shot had been fired. Dr. Collins stood frozen near the primary monitoring station. His datapad had slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor. He stared in absolute, uncomprehending horror at the massive female stalker dominating the center of his command center. Slowly, awkwardly, Caleb hauled himself up out of the maintenance shaft. He looked awful. He was barefoot, his gray uniform soaked in rusty water, his face pale and smeared with grease and ash. He climbed onto the shattered plotting table, coughing slightly, and looked down at the room. Buster immediately abandoned his post by the door, trotting over to the table and pressing his heavy head against Caleb's knee, letting out a loud, grinding purr. Caleb absent-mindedly rested his hand on the creature's armored neck. "Stand down, Mike," Caleb said, his voice quiet, but carrying clearly in the tense silence. Mike, pinned beneath Scrap, swallowed hard. "Hold your fire," he croaked to his terrified men. "Nobody moves." Caleb turned his attention to Dr. Collins. The scientist was completely pale, his eyes darting frantically from the terrifying creatures to the sanitation worker controlling them. "Caleb," Collins managed to say, his voice trembling, This is an unprecedented behavioral anomaly. The data, you have established a symbiotic command structure with a level 9 biological weapon." "I didn't establish a command structure, Doc," Caleb said, jumping down from the table. Princess moved with him, a massive, lethal bodyguard matching him step for step. "I gave them a warm place to sleep, and I didn't treat them like lab rats." Caleb walked right up to Collins. Princess loomed behind him, her jaws parting, the heavy scent of ammonia and ozone washing over the terrified scientist. "You're going to order a supply drop of the high-density protein paste. You're going to have it delivered to the lower hydroponics bay," Caleb ordered, his tone flat and cynical. "That bay is currently offline. It's warm, it's damp, and it has plenty of space. That is their new enclosure." "You can't dictate corporate policy, Caleb," Collins whispered, though he was leaning as far away from Princess's jaws as physically possible. "These are company assets." "You're right," Caleb agreed, a grim smile touching the corners of his mouth. "They are company assets, and as of right now, I am the only employee on Tartarus 9 who can walk into a room with them and walk out alive, which means I am no longer a sanitation engineer." Caleb leaned in, tapping a dirty finger against Collins's pristine white lab coat. "I am the lead handler of the Biological Assets Division. My salary just went up by 0.5% of Apex Biosolutions' gross planetary margin, retroactive to last week, and my first executive decision is that we don't do starvation trials anymore." Collins stared at Caleb, then looked at the 4 massive, heavily armored predators waiting patiently for Caleb's next move. The scientist's pragmatic corporate brain did the math. The assets were secured. A command interface, however unorthodox, had been established. It was a breakthrough, even if it meant yielding authority to a janitor. "Agreed," Collins swallowed, his clinical detachment slowly returning. "Lead handler," Caleb nodded. He looked down at Princess. "Come on, ugly," he sighed, the exhaustion of the day finally catching up to him. "Let's go get you some breakfast." Princess huffed, nudging Caleb's shoulder heavily, almost knocking him over. As Caleb walked toward the blast doors, the 4 nightmare creatures fell into line behind him, an impenetrable shadow of fangs and armor, following their alpha into the dark. If you enjoyed Predator Cubs Surrounded the Human's Bed, hit that like button and subscribe for more thrilling HFY sci-fi stories. What would you do if you woke up surrounded by alien apex predators? Let us know your survival strategies in the comments section below. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss a new upload, and share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans to help our channel grow. Your support allows us to keep bringing you intense